This is March I Am Online if you're just joining. And our topic for March, I want to welcome you to Self-Sovereign ID, the future of learner, teacher, and researcher credentials in the academic identity landscape. We're very excited about today's program and want to thank you again for joining. This is the monthly webinar series focused on identity and access management, brought to you by InCommon and Internet2. Before we get started, just a couple of quick reminders. This is our basic agenda for this afternoon. At this point, I am pleased to turn the virtual podium over to my colleague, Nicole Roy, who is our Director of Infrastructure and Operations, Trust and Identity Services.
Hi, everyone. As April said, I'm Nicole Roy. Welcome to I Am Online today. We're joined by Niels van Dijk, Technical Product Manager for Trust and Security at SURF in the Netherlands, and Carrie Lemoy, Director of Technology at the Digital Credentials Consortium at MIT. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Niels to kick things off today.
Yes, thank you, Nicole, and thank you to Internet2 for having me. I'm Niels van Dijk. I work at SURF in the Netherlands. We're the Dutch National Research and Educational Network. And today I'm going to present a brief overview of the work that we have done at SURF on self-sovereign identity and wallets, and also some work that was done in the GÉANT project. The GÉANT project is the collaboration between the NRENs in Europe. But I will kick off with a brief introduction into the SSI ecosystem to give the participants a bit of an introduction into the topic. I will try to also give you a bit of an idea later on in my presentation on why, especially in Europe, we're so well hyped, maybe is the right wording, about wallets and self-sovereign identity. And then I will return back to our own sector and talk a little bit about the use cases and a number of scenarios where self-sovereign identity might be relevant. I will talk a little bit about credentials, and then later on I will hand over to Carrie to continue a deep dive into the work that was done within the DCC. So most of the implementations, there are actually many self-sovereign identity implementations, deploy a model that looks roughly like what you're seeing here. This is the verifiable credential model taken from the W3C verifiable credentials specification. And actually, in this model, there are four main stakeholders, so to say. There are the issuers, which are the entities that hold credentials about users. They are typically authoritative for a certain credential or a group of credentials. You have the holder. The holder is the person, the user, who actually has a device typically and a piece of software typically called a wallet that is being used to collect various credentials from the issuers. And the wallet will securely store these credentials until at some point the holder, the user, decides to actually use these credentials and send them to a verifier. The verifiers are typically what we would call services. They, for some reason, want to learn about some of the credentials of the user and basically ask the user to present, for example, proof of possession of a certain email address, or proof of possession of a driver's license, or a proof of the fact that somebody is over 18. A credential that is very popular in our ecosystem is, of course, proof if somebody is a student. And the holder can then selectively disclose one or more of these credentials that were previously picked up from one of the issuers and selectively disclose these to the verifier. What's really interesting is that issuers can be many, and the holder may also have the opportunity to combine credentials from multiple issuers and present them towards the verifiers. So this is a model where there is no direct relation between the issuer and the verifier, as you can see, and that poses a problem, because how can the verifier establish that the credentials that are being presented are actually correct and legitimate? And to this end, a shared resource is being deployed, which is called the Verifiable Data Registry. And there's many implementation types of this registry. It could be something that would look like what we would recognize as SAML metadata. It could also be something else. There are implementations that actually deploy a distributed ledger or a blockchain for the purpose of having the verifiable data registry. But ultimately, this registry allows the verifier to validate that the credentials that are being presented by the holder were actually correctly issued by the issuer. Next slide, please. It's really nice, by the way, to have Nicole help me out, because it's the first time I think that I had a director assist me in forwarding my slides. So thumbs up, Nicole. The credential flow, I'm assuming, given that this is the identity management track, that most of you will be familiar with federated identity, like what we have with, for example, using a campus IT system, a campus identity provider to log into a service through, say, the incumbent federation. And the above part of this slide shows the credential flow in such a scenario. So there is an issuer, or an IDP, as it would be called in SAML. There is a verifier or a service provider, as it would be called in SAML. And if a user wants to log in, for example, the user is asked by the service provider, by the verifier, to prove possession of certain credentials. To do that, the user will go to the identity provider, the issuer. The user will log in there, and then the institution will send the credentials directly to the verifier, directly to the service. And for another service, this works in the same way, and for another service, and et cetera, et cetera. In a distributed identity scenario, this is a very different flow. As you can see, it begins with a sort of a preparatory phase. This is where the user goes to the issuer directly and picks up some credentials. This typically still requires authentication, so the user proves to be the person that the credentials need to be issued for. And then the credentials are loaded into the mobile device of the user, into the wallet. And then at a later point in time, the user goes to a specific service. The verifier will ask for proof of possession of certain credentials, and the user can provide them from the wallet without any interference at that point from the issuer or from the institution or the IDP. And at a later point, the same thing happens again. So if we would plot the various roles that we have in our research and education ecosystem onto the verifiable credential model, and that's the next slide, then actually a lot of the elements that we're familiar with and that we commonly use are actually already there. So issuers could be, of course, universities and institutions. It could be research institutions. Research communities could also be issuers. It could be that we have shared infrastructure platforms like, say, CI Logon to act as an issuer on behalf of certain research communities. But we could also imagine, for example, and this is why I took the driver's license as an example, that some attributes or credentials are released that are being that have been collected or can be collected from a government, for example, or a government agency. So centrally, we of course have the holder, and the holder has a wallet. Typically, there are not too many wallets in production use at this point, I think, within our community. But Carrie will later on showcase a very nice example. Verifiers, we have a lot, of course, as well. We have institutions themselves who can act as a verifier in receiving information either from other institutions or between branches of the institutions. This is also a model that would work really well for international exchange of credentials. And I will list a few use cases later on. We also have commercial services, of course, like say, for example, the publisher community or other services. Research communities, again, could also be verifiers. They run services typically for the purpose of their researchers, and this may actually be a target for a release of specific credentials as well. And this is an area where maybe we are a little bit, which is a little bit more novel, but one of the areas where specifically, for example, diploma information might be very useful is in going across our educational sector towards, for example, future employers or jobs boards or something like that, where folks would be able to use their digital diplomas and the digital credentials that were issued to them as part of their learning experience and release these towards these entities. The verifiable data registries, we have various bodies currently as well that can act in such a way. So we already have the national federation operators like Incommon and SurfConnext in the Netherlands. We have EduGain, which is a global interfederation of national identity federations. And they already have a role in the trust fabric that we use for authentication and authorization. So maybe we can reuse that trust model in an SSI ecosystem as well. One very new thing, or not so much new, but a thing that would put research communities on, basically on par with the current identity federations is that in an SSI model, it would also be significantly easier for research communities to have their own verifiable data registry implementations for their research communities. And I think that could actually be very useful for some of the research communities. Next one, please. So, as I mentioned, in Europe, we're currently really hyped, as I said, about self-sovereign identity. And this is because not too long ago, the European Union announced a new EU identity framework called EIDAS 2.0 that will have to be mandatorily implemented by all member states by ultimately 2024. The reason for this is, well, there's a number of reasons. One of the reasons is that the first version of this infrastructure or framework, the EIDAS 1.0, was, well, ultimately lacking implementation and lacking uptake. Of course, the EU will not say this was a failure. They use they have a bit nicer wording. Huge discrepancies in availability and adoption is what they call it. But ultimately, really, after sort of 10 years of trying to get EIDAS 1.0, 1.0 rolled out across Europe, they basically gave up and came up with a new thing, which is going to be the EU ID framework. They envision a number of scenarios which would make it a very commonly used infrastructure throughout Europe for all Europeans, renting a flat, bank accounts, driver's license, but also diplomas, which of course puts it squarely into our scope as well. They also want the wallet to be a qualified signature and seal creation device. And in effect, for us, that means that they will have to make sure that the wallets are EIDAS high, which is the highest level of assurance within the EIDAS framework. As I mentioned already, they're very ambitious with the rollout. 2024 is now set as the date. On a personal note, I would say that is really aspirational. But let's see how far they get. And there's a number of things that are probably interesting in and that are being supported by the EU in actually making this framework, which is basically legislation, into something real and tangible. And so, first of all, there is a group of experts from the various countries involved in writing down the requirements and the implementation. And this goes, I will go into that a little bit later as well, but this is about the technical implementation, the interfaces, but also, for example, the trust framework and the flows that are envisioned, stuff like, for example, also the crypto that is going to be used. It's all laid out by this expert group. They are going to, or they have already issued a contract for the implementation of a so-called reference wallet, which is a reference implementation of all the requirements that have been defined in the toolkit from the expert group. And this reference wallet is supposed to be able to store two kinds of sets of credentials. First of all, the so-called PID, which is the primary ID information. Think about it, the same sort of information that you would have in your passport or in your driver's license, and then also additional credentials. And finally, they have rolled out a program called the Large Scale Pilots, which is an open call to parties, both in academia, but also commercial, to actually go out and test the toolkit, the technologies that are proposed there, and the reference wallet implementation in large-scale setups. So across national borders, within national borders, with large groups of users, so that they can actually sort of learn and work towards a real ecosystem, a working ecosystem for this kind of, for this EU identity. Next slide, please. So this is a very high-level overview of what they envision. And I think there's a few interesting takeaways here. The two most important takeaways are that they are not only envisioning that state entities, government entities will be releasing credentials. Of course, they will also be releasing credentials. These are called the qualified electronic attestation providers. So think about what is called in the US, the agency that issues the driver's license, for example, entities like that. But and as I said, it should also be possible in the future to actually have your passport loaded into your wallet. But they're also explicitly mentioning the ability for so-called non-qualified attestation providers. And these could, in theory, be anything and anyone. It is very clear that they are thinking about, for example, sector-specific attestation providers. So that could be institutions, research institutions, or universities, high schools, but also maybe there could be a role there for NRENs, and again, for entities like the incumbents of Europe. I took the liberty of adding a number of blue arrows. These are not originally in the EU proposal, but these all point out to areas where probably we as a research and educational community could have a stake. For example, in setting up the catalogs of the attributes that need to be provided, we might be running trust registries. We will very likely be running relying parties, the verifiers, because we will be receiving some of these credentials. And it's also very likely that, and this is also one of the use cases that I will go into a little bit more later on, that we are going to try and make use of the PID, so the personal data, personal identifier, so the driver's license equivalent, for example, because now for the first time, at least for example in the Netherlands, it will become possible to have a state-issued identity digitally signed by the government to be used in other contexts than only in the context of the government. And this is really potentially a very powerful thing for us and would solve many of the challenges that we have in research and education in the Netherlands, at least. Next one. So the whole thing, the whole EU ID thing is very much in motion still. There's lots of stuff going on because all the three areas that I just mentioned, the standards definition and the standards body, the large-scale pilots, and the reference wallet are sort of being developed in parallel at the same time. This is an interesting approach. Let's call it that. Two of the things that might be really interesting and relevant for the research and educational community also beyond Europe is I highlighted here. So one of the large-scale pilots projects is called Digital Credentials for Europe. And this is a pilot project, a large-scale pilot project that focuses primarily on EID diplomas and professional qualifications. So this might also be very relevant for the educational community in the US ultimately, because it might be that Europeans start turning up with wallets containing credentials that were issued or at least tested as part of this work. And actually, there's a number of EU NRANs involved in this project as well, together with commercial companies and also with the relevant government bodies that deal with the diploma issuance. And I've listed them here. SURF is one of them. Also, Géant as a lead in the Géant project is also involved, and the URL is there as well, should you want to learn more. We're expecting to start somewhere between now and another few months, actually. The other thing is the, well, it's it's a mouthful, but it's the Common Union Toolbox for the coordinated approach towards a European digital identity framework. This is basically the reference architecture and the standards definition that are going to be used as the basis for this ecosystem. And so they very recently released the first version, the 1.0 version of the architecture and reference framework, or the RF in short. And this basically describes the flows that are expected, the trust frame requirements, and the ideas about the participants and what requirements they would have to live up to. And they also describe two standards as the main model for the interaction between the issuers, the verifiers, and the wallets, the holders. So on one end, this is an ISO standard that is the MDL standard, mobile driver's license. And the other one is W3C verifiable credentials model combined with OpenID Connect for verifiable credentials. And especially the latter two are, I think, really, really interesting, because we as an research and education community have, I think, been paying considerable attention to the OpenID Connect specification, and we're pretty familiar with it. Shibboleth IDP, for example, has the capability to be an OP, as it's called, with OpenID Connect. And so I think, and on top of that, the verifiable credential model is really a very broadly usable standard, which I think suits us very nicely as we have as we may have a very large set of potential credentials that we could exchange in this way. And I've put a link up as well to point to the architectural reference document. Next one, please. And I'm going to speed up a little bit. So what are the use cases that we're thinking about? And these are really high-level use cases, by the way. There's a lot more depth here. So first of all, what I've called EduID. And EduID is in several implementations in Europe. It's basically a stable identifier and a set of basic attributes that you can use throughout your academic and educational career. And also you can keep them after you actually leave your institution. And if you were to have these credentials as part of your wallet, which means that you could use them throughout your life, sort of after leaving the university, but then if you would 10 years down the line return to some other university, you could actually use these credentials to bootstrap yourself into the institution, for example. It would also be, for example, very easy to attach alumni information to such an identity as well, and provide services for alumni in this way, in a very easy way. There's a number of scenarios around student mobility, lifelong learning, and citizen scientists that are also relevant. For student mobility, for example, one of the challenges we've seen is that if students go from one university to the other to do a minor within one university, currently they typically get a complete new identity rolled out for them. With an EduID-like ecosystem or scenario, maybe that would not be needed, and you would simply have the institution that is supporting the minor add some additional credentials to the wallet, but not spin up a complete new identity. And another really interesting area is that also we might actually be able to build, depending a little bit on how legislation will play out, to build the EduID on top of a government ID. And this could be especially interesting for a long-lived persistent identifier. We will probably not be able to use the exact same identifier as the government is issuing. That might even not be very nice from a privacy perspective, but an identifier that is somehow derived from this identity from this government-based identity would actually be a very nice basis, I guess. Next one. Diplomas and micro-credentials, and I will only go over this very briefly because Carrie will talk you through this much more. But the trusted exchange of digital diploma information in between institutions is also towards future employers, for example, would be one of the areas where there's a very clear opportunity. And this could be the formal diplomas, but this could also be micro-credentials, as these are called, or badges, open badges. In the Netherlands, we have a service called edu badges. And the picture actually shows one of the things that we were testing with InSurf, where we have a micro-credential issuance towards a wallet, in this case from Wageningen University in the Netherlands. Next use case is about research. And as you're probably aware, or a researcher identity is typically already an aggregate of multiple sources. So there's institutional information in this identity. The virtual organization, the research community will add additional credentials. In some cases, there might be external identity providers or external attribute providers as well. Think, for example, about an ORCID identifier that might be added as well to the identity. So all of these credentials could be collected by this end user directly into a wallet. Currently, a number of research communities deploy a proxy model to do this aggregation. It might be that a wallet could either partially or maybe completely at some point take over or take away the need to have the proxy model here. Another really interesting thing, and I already briefly mentioned that, is that currently the trust model that we have in identity federations globally, I would say, is where the national federation sort of is operated on behalf of the institutions. And actually, it's turned out over the years that for research communities, it was pretty hard to have a trust ecosystem that was sort of on par with the trust ecosystem that the national federations are offering for the institutions. With this SSI model, it might actually be much easier to have an ecosystem that is more on par, because it will much more easily allow them to define their own trust relations within such an ecosystem. And also, some of these relations might actually be significantly more agile, because they don't require all the pre-configured exchange of metadata, for example, as we have in the SAML identity federations. But in all honesty, this is still a maybe. This has not been thoroughly tested. Next one. So where is SSI going to make a difference? First of all, and this is one of the starting points for SSI, is that it will make end-user interaction and end-user control over personal data much better. It might also remove the use for the need for users to switch between multiple accounts. For institutions, but also for services, it might reduce the cost of onboarding, because we can leverage existing good quality credentials from other sources, like, for example, a government. The cost of trust establishment might be reduced. Currently, with Identity Federation, it's a really nice and really trustworthy, trustful system, I would say, but it's also fairly expensive because we have to make all these relations, publish them in metadata, etc. So if there is an overarching trust ecosystem that we could leverage to take this away from us, that might actually be interesting and may save us some cost. It might also scale better into areas where we typically currently do not engage, like, for example, towards future employers. And as I mentioned already, we might have a more agile and a more dynamic system and a more dynamic capability to describe our trust relation between entities. But there's also some stuff that's going to stay, and that's the next slide. So we still want sector-specific identifiers and sector-specific credentials. And so we will have to work on standardizing these for this new environment and for this new ecosystem. It is very likely that diplomas will still be issued, the formal diplomas will still be issued by state-like qualified trust attestation providers. But how will that work for these badges and these micro-credentials? So we may need to redefine some of the relations around that. it is very clear that SSI is a very flexible concept, but it doesn't really mean that it makes all of this much cheaper, so to say. For example, verifiers will have to be more picky and more knowledgeable about what kind of trust relations they're going to accept. They will have to do much of the heavy lifting in the ecosystem. Also, if we're going to roll out SSI ecosystems, what is going to be the cost and the benefit for institutions for their local IT, for example, and for the applications that they're going to run? And it might actually be that we are still going to need some middle things to do protocol translation, for example, between, say, SAML and this SSI ecosystem. And I also honestly think that, especially for like contract-based relations, like we have many campus systems that employ, for example, a learning platform or something, then actually the direct relation, given the direct relation, a federated identity system is probably still going to be more easy and more intuitive to the end users than a wallet model and a self-sovereign identity model. So it's very likely, I would say, that for, well, at least the next decade, we will have both of these ecosystems in parallel. And that comes with a number of challenges potentially. So on the next slide, I have a few of them. So first of all, we must make sure that identifiers will be shareable between these ecosystems. If a user logs into a federated service and then wants to share some of the data from the federated service into the wallet, then we must make sure that identifiers can be shared between these ecosystems. Wallet systems allow for selective disclosure, but in various scenarios, like for example with the badges, actually bundling them together as one credential makes much more sense. So how do these two concepts actually relate to each other, and when does it make sense to have one and to have the other? You could also, this is one of the nice features, I would say, from the credential ecosystem, is that we can also present some of these things as Boolean. So are you a student, yes or no? And finally, we may need to think about how we can actually query, find, and search information that is in the wallets, because it's not a very nice thing if somebody would have to sort of basically empty all the credentials from the wallet into a service and then allow the service to sort of pick and choose from the credentials. Final slide from me. Standardization will be the most important thing, I think. And first of all and foremost, we should really try to re-engage maybe even as a community with the standards bodies that are working on the things that will define this ecosystem. So OpenID Connect for verifiable credentials, W3C. We need to think about the software and the middle things that we might need to roll out to support this on behalf of our institutions. And we really need to start thinking about content beyond authentication and authorization, because a lot of the credentials that we will want to be sharing will actually not be AI related, but will be other stuff like badges, verifiable credentials. And this is actually the work, one of the things that the Digital Credentials Consortium is working on. And with that, I would like to hand over to Carrie.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Niels. There's so much in there and it's super informative. And I think what I can do is maybe add to that, fill in some things from the DCC perspective and tell you a little bit about what we're doing. So hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Carrie Lemoy, and I'm from the Digital Credential Consortium, also often referred to as the DCC. I'll tell you a little bit about what we do, how we work, and how we help institutions and the wider ecosystem understand and implement what we refer to as the verifiable digital credentials space in education specifically right now. Anyway, we are working with, we say we're working with learning and employment records, but right now we're primarily focused on the academic ones. I'm going to put a couple of links in the chat for you. This first link is a link to our website. And then this other second link is a link to our white paper, which is on that slide right there too. So the consortium was founded in 2018 by 12 higher ed institutions in Canada, US, Mexico, and Europe. We're incubating at MIT, and that's where me and my team work. The idea behind the consortium is to design a digital infrastructure for interoperable and verifiable digital academic credentials. So what that means that what we aim to do is transform academic and employment achievements into trusted tokens of social and human capital that can create new opportunities for education and employment. We believe that learners should be able to have access and control over their secure and verifiable records and their lifetime learning achievements for as long as they need them throughout their lives. And you can see that ties like directly right into what Niels was explaining about how self-sovereign identity technologies work. We aim to make this process as streamlined and as affordable as possible for institutions. And that is who we are working with directly right now to help make this happen. Next slide, please. Okay, so we approach this from several angles. So we support and facilitate the development of open standards. We participate in some key working groups. One of them that we started a couple of years ago is the Verifiable Credentials for Education Task Force. That's the first bullet. I'm co-chair of that along with Dimitri Zagadulin. We're both on the DCC team. And our third co-chair is Simone Ravioli, who works for Parchment, but is located in Italy and provides an excellent approach to thinking about this globally. We also participate in the community credentials group at the W3C. We work with the Decentralized Identity Foundation and also most recently Open Wallet Foundation. So we stay pretty busy with all of these standards, staying in the loop on what they're doing and contributing as best as we can from this perspective in education. The second activity we do is we develop software. And I'm going to put a link to our libraries here. These are all open source libraries. It's a little bit overwhelming when you get into our GitHub organization because we have, I think, about 80 repositories. We're not using all of them in the same way, but you'll see that all of our software is open and MIT licensed. And we use these libraries to support deployments, but we also work with ecosystem to adapt the software for their use cases. And in a few minutes, I'll just go through some of the main components that sort of align to the verifiable credentials framework that Neil showed you. It's important to note that we also like to work with vendors, right? We are not a product company. We're a consortium of institutions trying to increase adoption. So when possible, we like to try and find vendors that work with us to help make this possible. We also do research. So whenever possible, we try to do that. We have a report that we just released last year, I believe. Put this link in the chat for you. This is a report that was done, some research that was done with employers. That is about what they think about this space. And we also hold community calls. For instance, we just had one last week that was that included researchers from Georgia Tech, and they presented their finding with researchers that they did with employers about a wallet application. Next slide, please. So verifiable credentials in education. So part of the task force work has been to think about how education data standards can be aligned with verifiable credentials. Education data standards have been around for a long time. Things like open badges have been around for well over a decade, but not aligned with verifiable credentials. So we are chartered to do those work items where we gather use cases, and then we try to develop models and recommendations for standards bodies to align to those use cases. One of the first proposals we did in 2000, it says 2019 in my slide, but I think it was 2020 where we started this for Open Badges 3.0, which I will put a link to right here. We worked on Open Badges 3.0 because Open Badges are a very small, compact credential and already had sort of a verification method. You could always digitally sign Open Badges, even though people mostly didn't. People mostly hosted them on web pages. but there was an opening and a very similar model. One sort of unknown like trivia fact is actually some of the use cases from verifiable credentials were written by members of the Open Badges community a long time ago. So Open Badges actually switched over to JSON LD for version 1.5. And that was because of the work that was already going on in the thinking behind verifiable credentials, which at the time was called verifiable claims. So there was already this sort of movement towards these. So we decided to make this proposal, and the One Ed Tech, which previously was called IMS Global, decided to move forward on this. And just recently I released it. So that link in the chat is the most recent version of Open Badges. Next slide, please. So I'll tell you a little bit about this, because I think that in education, there will definitely be many models of how to do verifiable in education, verifiable credentials in education. In Europe, they're working on a similar model too. And we know that that's going to happen, and we know that's okay. There's JSON LD, there is context files and vocabularies to help verifiers and developers understand what all of those are. So it's kind of structured for there to be multiple ones. But we did Open Badges 3.0, and we started working on that already this year. As I sort of said before, the Open Badges previously were web hosted, and lots of times they were issued and they sat on web servers and no one ever saw them again. And no one ever used them. Maybe they shared them once in social media, and that's about it. One of the biggest problems with this, as many of you I'm sure know, is that there's no historical reliability for web servers and for data on web servers. Anybody can make those changes, and no one would know, right? So there isn't a lot of trust there. And so the trust is proxied by the domain or the issuer, but you just really couldn't use these types of credentials for things like diplomas or even student IDs. So we saw this opportunity to do this alignment so that we could use badges, or the Open Badges standard, for things beyond just badges. So Open Badges 3.0 can be used for diplomas. It can be used for licensing, certifications, and even micro-credentials, right? So it expands the applicability of the standard to be much more verifiable. Next slide, please. Mostly I covered this. Is sort of a comparison of the two. So before 3.0, verification was hosted or signed, or really human verification. Hardly ever was the data even looked at by machines. Most of the time, it was just what was ever displayed on the web page. It was required that there be an assertion file and a badge class and an issuer profile, and all of that needed to be hosted somewhere. That is not required with Open Badges 3.0. All of it can be encapsulated in the credential. The learner identity for older versions of Open Badges was email, but now they can be decentralized identifiers, but they can still be email and usernames and other things. It's not required to be a decentralized identifier, because we know that some bridging has to happen. We can't just flip the switch, but it's great that we can use decentralized identifiers. And as someone who's been involved with Open Badges since the beginning, email has always been a problem with Open Badges, because as soon as someone changes their email or moves on to another system, they might lose access to that email and probably access to that badge. With badge image, it was always required previously. In fact, the badge image was the carrier for the data. That was intended to be anyway. Like, you pack the data into the badge image, then you send that badge image through, say, an email, and someone can unpack it and read it. But that's not necessary with verifiable credentials. So for the first time ever in Open Badges, the badge image is optional. You don't really need that, which is, it's useful, but you don't have to. And then lastly, no control of data by learners, right? Learners can't do anything with it. It is on a server, somebody else controls it. But with Open Badges 3.0, as with verifiable credentials, they can sit in their wallet. And they have control, they have access to it for as long as they need it throughout their lives. Next slide, please. I won't stay on this one too long, but for those of you who are interested, this is what an Open Badge 3.0 looks like. One ed tech has a lot of other data properties that can be inserted. So it makes it even more usable for different uses. So this one is an example. I don't remember where I grabbed it from, but I think it is intended to be a bachelor degree. So it represents a diploma. And you can see that it was issued by, name of university, and that it was digitally signed. And the next slide, please. Okay, so I'll tell you, back up a little bit more to the DCC and tell you what we're doing to help move this along. As I mentioned before, everything we do is standards involved, right? So we're aligned with the core standards. We believe in open standards and open source software. We're very community driven. So we have a leadership council and we have a working group where we discuss what is going on and help each other build out the software that they need. Everything is done through an MIT license, and we do our best to develop as much documentation and support. I imagine we'll keep doing that more and more and better going forward. Next, please. Okay, so this is the verifiable credential framework that Neil showed you at the very beginning of our presentation. So I'm just going to show you a little bit about, or explain a little bit about what we have for software at GCC that aligns with this model. So this first one that I have a highlight over is the issuing software libraries. And this is the issuer aspect. So what we have for issuers are things like for software that does an administrative interface, possibly sort of a interaction with student records, the software to digitally sign this and to sign the credentials and to issue them. And then also we're working on, there is some kind of like front-facing page where the students can go to collect their credentials. So we have various packages of these different types of software that we can put together and provide to institutions to meet the needs that they have for their credentialing systems. Next slide, please. So the next part we have is our wallet. And I'm going to put a link to our wallet here. It's called the Learner Credential Wallet application. And I'll go a little bit quick here. So much as Neil's described with wallets, this is where students would download the wallet on their application, on their phone, sorry, and they would create their account. And then they could go to that collection page that the issuing institution has and either click on a link through their app or use a scan code, and they can authenticate with the institution's platform, whatever the institution is using there, which is a great topic. I'm sure all of you think about a lot. The institution recognizes the student, tells the wallet that's true, and then the wallet says, here's the student's decentralized identifier. Can you please issue to that credential? And then the issuer returns it, a signed version of their credential, and the learner can choose to accept it in their wallet, where they can make a link to share it or present it to a verifier that requests it. I way oversimplified that because of time, but that's essentially the overview of how that works. The next slide. The next part is a Verifier Plus. We're going to be releasing this soon. This actually works with the wallet too. When you create a link from the wallet, it actually creates it as part of this system called Verifier Plus, so that when someone clicks on this link, it goes into this Verifier Plus and it shows that the issuer has been verified, and the rest of the information is validated according to the specification. There's also a web front end where you can plug in or upload a credential and it will show that it's verified. So we hope that this will be a useful tool for verifiers to use, as we start moving more and more in that direction. There's more of those credentials. And then lastly, next slide, please, is our registry. So we have a series of registries that we host. Our members are registered in these registries, in these trust registries, so that when verifiers go to validate or verify the credentials, they can see that these issuers have been, there's some like KYC there, that somebody has recognized them and validated them. And so we've been providing that service to our members. Okay, and I think that's what I have for now. I know I want to leave some time for questions, but I do want to let folks know that we are going to be expanding our membership. So if that interests you, or if you just want to learn more about any of this, I'm going to put my email address in the chat for you. Feel free to email me and reach out. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Carrie and Niels. And so we do have a little bit of time left. There's some questions in the Q&A section, and I would encourage others to go ahead and post those there. And thank you to Niels for answering those in text ahead of time. I'm going to go ahead and read those, and you all should please feel free to chime in on the answers, just so we can get these into the verbal record, as it were. So the first question is from Mike. My question is, I assume the ID wallet would be platform agnostic. Who in the long run would be developing and maintaining this application or software? How is the trust between research and education and government and business established?
You want me to pick that up, Nicole?
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So that's really an excellent question, as I wrote as well. And especially in the EU case, this is really an interesting challenge as well, because EIDAS legislation mandates that wallets must be provided to end users for free. And also any data mining like things are forbidden. So it's really an open question on what would be the business model for wallet developers. Value-added services have been mentioned, but they will have to be very carefully not to end up mining data. So that will have to include very good consent mechanisms, I guess, and stuff like that. It's really, in all honesty, a little bit unclear how that would work. And that's actually a big problem, because on the other side, on the flip side of the same legislation, there are some pretty steep mandatory requirements on the technical quality of the wallet and the security model of the wallet, and you would have to be pretty knowledgeable entity to build such a wallet and to maintain that. So it's not entirely clear, I would say, how that would play out. We might actually see some of the larger vendors out there, did I say Apple and Google, to take a stake of this market as well. They typically already have wallet-like applications, maybe not living up to the exact specifications from the EU, for example, but still one of the standards, the mobile driver's license standard, is already being implemented in the Apple Wallet, for example. I know that the Microsoft Authenticator already has some capabilities for consuming verifiable credentials as well. So stuff is moving there as well. But yeah, it's a very good question, and we will have to see how that plays out. I think another open question is still, should we as research communities build our own wallets? Currently, at this point, I think the answer is yes, because there's not a single product that is good enough for our needs, I guess. But in the long run, we may want to piggyback on some existing infrastructures from others. I don't know. And the second question, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and I'd like to see what Carrie's thoughts on this are, because I think in the learner credential space, things, and specifically in the United States, things may be different. So Carrie, do you have thoughts about this?
Yeah, I mean, in the US, we're primarily vendor driven. Organizations like the DCC are providing, some software for people to build upon, but it is mostly vendors that are building this out. And keeping in mind, it's very different in the States because we don't have an identity provided by the government. So it all works a little bit differently here. We do have the government getting involved, though. The Department of Homeland Security has been doing a lot of work in this space. So I imagine the government will get more and more involved as we get going.
Okay. And I do need to apologize. It's likely we won't get to all the questions there. Thank you for posting those. And we'll, I think, have opportunities to follow up after the webinar, but I'm going to try and get to the next question. So this one is from an anonymous attendee, and it says, can you comment on any work being done to ensure that the contents of a wallet cannot be stolen, specifically within the context of compromising a mobile device as opposed to, somebody meddling in the middle? And even more specifically, the patch state of phones in the United States, for example, is not very good. We have data to suggest that people are not keeping their mobile devices patched. So how do we mitigate that risk?
Yeah, this is definitely a big issue, clearly. And this is only one of the areas where we may have problems, of course. Loss of your mobile devices is another question I saw mentioned as well, is a challenge as well. So all of these things will have to be addressed. I think one of the ways that this specific question will be addressed or might be addressed is that we will see that trust frames will be mandating certain levels, patch levels of mobile devices, hence making it at least less likely that these kinds of things happen. And this is a little bit similar to what we did with federations, for example, where you said, well, okay, we're not going to support, say, Internet Explorer version something, because we know that the technology stack is no longer good enough to be able to support our transactions in a trusted way. So I suspect that something like that will happen, but it doesn't mean that there's still not some interesting challenges there, for sure. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you. And
Sorry, can I
Carrie,
say
did you
one
have
quick thing? Just
Yeah,
super quick
absolutely.
to add to this, because I think Niels is right. But keep an eye out for things like web wallets, browser-based wallets where
Yeah.
people can choose where they can store their data. So I think that's coming up the next year or so for sure.
Good to know. Thank you. And at this point, I'll turn it back over to April to close things out.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you to Nils and Carrie. We appreciate the excellent information that you've shared this afternoon. What an excellent program. As Nicole said, we weren't able to get to all the questions, but as possible, we will follow up with folks. Want to let you know that, again, the event was recorded and will be posted on our IM Online website. So you can look for that there, and everyone attending this afternoon will also receive an email with that recording information. Also, there is a quick 4-question survey as you leave, so we really appreciate your feedback about IM Online. So if you would take a moment to complete that survey, we would greatly appreciate it. And lastly, we will be back next month with another great program, so please check your email and our website for details. With that, we thank you again for participating and joining us this afternoon. We hope to see you in April for April IM Online. Have a great rest of the day.